Hey, Matt, I want to thank you for joining me today. As I mentioned to you when we were setting up this call, I've got lots of customers asking questions about Azure or whatever it is all the time. And I thought, who better to go to than Neon Cobra, like my Azure guy who knows all of
There
the
we go.
things, and sort of throw it to you. So maybe just for people that don't know you, can you kick it off with like a 2-minute, who am I? What do I do?
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm not going to go on the record of actually telling you how to pronounce Azure because I feel like depending on what region of the world you end up in, it's random. So I say Azure, but so myself, I'm based in Southern Ontario. I've worked in the IT and MSP industry for probably coming up to about 10, 11 years at this point, spending a lot of time doing architecting and design, working with different organizations, accounting firms, law firms, commercial, not for profit. So really getting a lot of kind of time in the market and established to kind of find out what technology was working for a lot of businesses. I spent my last few years working with a company called Pax8, helping organizations really kind of adopt Azure as a means to really go to market and deliver the next generation of technology to their clients. And as you mentioned, I run a kind of a little side project called Neon Cobra, where I run educational videos and series for service providers like yourself that are looking to really up their game within the Azure space.
Awesome. Really appreciate that. Thanks so much. So why don't we just like jump right into it? We'll keep it, I always try to keep this no fluff and easy to
Yeah.
work on. So why don't we talk about like what Azure is compared to, a traditional server that somebody might have in their office?
For sure. It's funny because a lot of times they would, when you ask someone what cloud is or Azure is, they'll say it's someone else's computer. And while this is kind of true, it's really much more than this. It is Microsoft's behemoth. It has anything that an organization from SMB to enterprise would be looking for, right? From security, from platform services, really go to market strategies, anything you really, really want will generally be found within this cloud. What we'll find a lot of times is that takes really some experts behind the scenes to really dial in and bring you to exactly what you need, because it's like walking through a Costco. You go there for, eggs and you walk out with a $400 cart all of a sudden, right? So sometimes you need someone to guide you through it. That's probably what I would like in Azure too, is just infinite amount of choices. But you can find the right ones to really accelerate your business.
And so that makes it different than an on-prem server where you've got kind of, your one choice or
Yeah. You'll find, the on-prem servers can be very limiting at times, especially when market environments or even just the environments we live in are changing constantly. We'll talk about, we always use COVID, right, as the example of like the whole world had to redesign itself in 2 weeks when
right.
everything went into lockdown, right? And from an IT standpoint, we found a lot of the traditional server infrastructure really came under heel because they couldn't do remote services. They didn't have that option. There was no way. So a lot of organizations had to scramble, and then a boat gets jammed in a canal, and then suddenly no one can get computers anymore.
Right.
So, there's all this stuff, and, tariffs notwithstanding right now too, as potentially like, is my server going to be 2x the cost it was last year or last time I bought it? So you'll find these odd constraints, unpredictable constraints with on-premise that you'll run into a lot of times.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think also we've seen, companies that are working towards scaling their organizations were historically put into a position of, do I buy all the horsepower now and hope that I will use it?
Yeah.
Or do I buy less than I need for the future and potentially increase costs down the road? There was no
And hope you can,
right. I
because
hope. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. Yeah. Because,
because sometimes it's you've backed yourself into a corner. You can't find those drives that are compatible with that system. So you got to buy a whole new server. So there was
right.
no cost savings. You just had to put another $50,000 down.
Exactly.
So
We
yeah.
call it the undo to redo
Yeah.
situation for
That's
sure.
great.
So, yeah, I think that the Azure, the ability to kind of scale up and down with requirement is a huge
Mhm.
benefit of it for sure. And some of the other solutions that we've dealt with in the past that are more kind of like halfway between an Azure type environment and on-prem, you're basically you are in somebody else's computer.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
scaling up resources clearly not as easy as just a
Mhm.
configuration change in Azure. So
And there's nothing, it's funny because there's nothing really wrong with it being on someone else's computer, because a lot of the stuff you're consuming now anyways, like whether it's your Office 365, your QuickBooks Online, like choose your software provider of choice. That's hosted somewhere else.
right.
at least you can control data residency and things like that that are, that are important to you within the Azure environment. And you take a lot of certain burdens of ownership away, right? It's the responsibility model. You are no longer responsible for physical security, fire prevention, resiliency, redundancy. Like that now is removed from you as a burden.
Right.
By it being somebody else's computer, it's somebody else's problems now. So, it's really up to them to look after it.
Yeah, that's a great point. I've never really considered it from that perspective. That you're sort of offsetting some of the risk to Microsoft in the case of Azure to own that risk. And I know lots of customers. Do they really want to set up a failover site in Ireland and pay for it for the likelihood that something may happen once in the next 20 years?
Right.
Probably not. Right. So
yeah.
So you talked a little bit about kind of some of the benefits of Azure. What are some of the disadvantages from an Azure perspective to an SMB? Is there specific reasons why they shouldn't consider or wouldn't be as good as potentially some on-premise hardware?
Yeah. So even just taking it a step back from on-premise, like evaluating the business case and the workloads in particular is what matters, right? We'll find a lot of times when we're assessing, SMB, even some mid-market sized, we need to look at their applications and what they're doing. And sometimes we'll find it's like, you actually don't need a server. If your server is just a traditional file host and it's holding archive data, like you're going to pay $30,000 for a new one to do that. You've got your SharePoints, you've got your OneDrives, things that you're likely already paying for and consuming in some capacity. So for SMB, there is a very real path of going completely serverless, right? Cloud infrastructure to maintain items, keep it nice and secure, keep it tight. And then there is no server anymore. But sometimes there's that line of business app that is legacy, doesn't have a cloud option, doesn't work nice. That's when you would evaluate moving into a cloud operating system or a cloud infrastructure in this case. Second to this, one of the big things would be just very poor internet, right? There, I've had clients that were, like greenhouses that were in the middle of fields on port to site Wi-Fi, right? I'm not going to put them in the cloud. There is no way that is a good experience for them, right? So, understanding workload is really step one on positioning it. But I would say everyone would qualify and be a good fit. You just have to see the value, right? It's got to address the business values really to make, if you're trying to chase what's the cheapest, I'll tell you, I've told other clients, Azure is not going to be the cheapest. But what you're not spending upfront in cost, you're spending elsewhere in value loss, security loss, potentially resiliency, right? Things that may or may not be very impactful to your business, opportunity loss, like all this stuff. So it can be a very hard conversation. So we really need to understand what is valuable to the clients when we're positioning it and what makes sense for their business. And it tends to act as an accelerator once you've dialed those in.
Yeah, that's great feedback. Thanks so much. Have you seen Azure being able to accelerate either remote work or BYOD strategies for customers that may have wanted to go down that path, but were a little reluctant to let people into their traditional sort of network infrastructure deployment?
Yeah, for sure. It's actually probably one of the leading adoptions, less on the BYOD, but also very sustainable in that sense, but more around the remote work, right? Azure Virtual Desktop is one of its flagship offerings. And we've seen a lot of, especially like accounting, law firms, anyone that, tends to deal with highly sensitive information, perhaps maybe need to outsource resources on occasion. Virtual desktoping is a tremendous boon for them, right? The ability to spin things up in a secured fashion, deploy them rapidly, and then rip them away rapidly as well. Right? If we're talking decentralizing your workforce, work from home, whatever the case is, going remote, the biggest risk you always have is I shipped a laptop and now they're not answering anymore. So what do I do? My data's on that laptop, and then you're trying to figure out ways to recover it, prevent data loss. This all kind of goes out the window if you set up a properly secured virtual desktop.
Right. 100%. Really appreciate that. So we kind of if you had to put in one sentence or a couple sentences, because you and I talk, we're not known to be one sentence people. What would you say the biggest single benefit or a couple biggest benefits, sort of as a summary statement, of Azure for an SMB would be?
Leverage enterprise investment in scale without the cost, right? If we can tagline that, but the subsection with the star after it is essentially this infrastructure, everything in Azure services the biggest organizations in the world, the most secure environments, DoD compliancy, PETA in Canada. The Canadian government has a line that if it has to be in the cloud, it needs to be Microsoft Azure. Like that's their alignment due to security, right? But generally, this type of stuff comes with a cost, and the cost was paid by the enterprise. So you don't have to go and turn on all the DoD level security, but you can if you want to. You don't have to hire massive teams to build out, scaling infrastructure and site resiliency. It's already in there. You can turn it on as you need to. So you will find that you are freer in Azure because everyone else already paid the price for you to get it there, to get it developed. And then now you get to just take advantage of what you want.
That's fantastic. I really appreciate that. So, similar to the last question, I think if you had to provide advice, so let's pretend I don't know what Azure is. What's one piece of advice you would give me if I was an SMB business owner to kind of make sure I had in the back of my mind as I considered walking down the path of modernizing my office? Do I go down on-prem? Do I go to cloud? Is there sort of a couple pieces or a single piece of advice that I should always have in the back of my head during my conversations?
Find the value. Right? Find out what's important. There is, I don't know if it's predominantly a Southern Ontario or perhaps, just maybe the small to medium business mentality, but IT has always been a cost center and not a business driver. And I think we're starting to see the shifts, right? Maybe it was COVID, maybe it was just us trying to catch up to other industries, but you should not look at your bottom line IT costs as that's what it took just to run the business. You should look at what value did that money and what sort of investment that I put in, what did that bring back for me, right? You'll see money spent on like marketing and advertising. And then if you land on your website and it's 20 years old, like I'm not clicking on that. Like there's certain things staff, are more likely to stick around if they're not fighting the technology and process all the time. Right. So it's those unspoken costs. So when we were trying to position and really not even win a sale, but really align with your client, understanding what their value talk tracks are, what is important to their business, what do they plan to do with their business? One good example I've always used is if I'm talking to a business owner and they're like, I plan to exit the business in the next 3 to 5 years, right? I want to do an M&A, I want to sell, whatever the case is. That's important bits of information. That is like a prime candidate for Azure because you don't want to sell them physical assets because that becomes just liability and, stuff that they have to then give to another organization and they got to figure out what they're doing with it. If they're in Azure and they sell, they are much more easier to be adopted because then they can scale that infrastructure immediately. They can shift it into their Azure. They can shut it down and there's no tech debt. Right. So that would be a value conversation. It has nothing to do with like what server is the best for them at this current time. It's where do you intend to bring the business? What are you hoping to do? What's current pain points? What's the value? Let's solve for these. And sometimes Azure is the answer to that. Sometimes it's a box in a corner, right? Sometimes you just need a box to, handle scans and things like that. And that's about all you would want to do. I'm not going to sell you Azure for that. I can if you want it, but it's the value sell and finding the value would be what I would advise anyone looking to position or put Azure in play because you have to sell them on it. And it has to prove itself every time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's great advice. I actually had a conversation with a prospective client yesterday, and it's not just a Southern Ontario thing. I think it might be an Ontario thing because we were talking about his key goals. I think this is why we're in alignment. Is I always feel technology needs to come out of business outcome. It's not the first question; it's the second question, and which is basically what you just said. And talking to this client, he had said to me, the reason we were speaking was he felt like technology was not an enabler for their business.
Right.
And so I think that's a great advice. What you gave there is to go sit back. Like, what are you actually trying to do? Where are you actually trying to go? What are the things that tech should make easier that you struggle with,
Yeah.
and then try and go solve for those problems, as opposed to shoehorn the latest, insert manufacturer name server here, or
Yeah.
insert cloud provider name here. If you don't focus on what you're trying to achieve, you can spend a lot of money in the wrong place.
Yeah.
And so that's really great advice. Really appreciate your insights on that.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting thing when we look at it too with the physical infrastructure is really all that we're doing was taking the old stuff and just putting a new sheen on it and moving it to new platforms because while there's been some major advancements, it really hasn't been in the physical server infrastructure. It's been in with platform services and software services offerings that exist in and around Azure. So, if I'm looking at, all these problems I'm trying to deal and address with, if my solution is to just like take you from server 2016 and move you to server 2022 or 2025, like it might be faster, you might get a couple of new bells and whistles, but it's probably not going to solve any issues,
Right.
right? It's just kind of kicking the can down the road. The true evolution and movement into Azure is also bringing in new technology to solve problems that you didn't think you could solve before, right? There's a major aspect of refactoring and redesigning, sometimes workflow redesigns, but the goal is to be better going into it than it was coming out of it.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I also think that, I don't have hard numbers, but my perception is that a lot of investment on innovation tends to be around, the Azure or AWS platform side of things. It's
Yeah.
way easier for a manufacturer to build something to plug into something that they understand exactly how it operates,
Right.
or
Yeah.
standardized, than trying to build, something for all the different chipsets that are out there and all of those kinds of things. So,
Yeah.
so we've absolutely seen that for sure. I think, for me, one of the things we really enjoy as a sort of a middle person between our clients and Azure is the ability to roll up resources or roll down resources,
Yeah. Yeah.
virtually instantaneously. So, for some reason a workload seems to be running slow, we can provide more horsepower to it. We have one particular client that runs a lot of mathematical modeling and computations once a
Yep.
month. So for that couple days while they're running all their computations that used to take, 7 days to 14 days straight of runtime, hopefully without a power blip, hopefully without a network glitch.
Yeah.
Now we just give them 2 days, 48 hours of more
Yep.
horsepower than they could ever afford to buy, and then run it back down after the
Right back down.
computations have
Yeah.
been done. So a lot of advantages for that, for sure. So.
Excellent.
Well, listen, I really appreciate your time. Is there anything you want to leave us with? If I was a client and I've watched this video on LinkedIn or on a blog post, and I want to learn more, what's the best step to learn more?
I would say reach out to your trusted partners, right? So on IT in this case, if you're watching this, they should be your trusted partner. But realistically, like if you want to learn more, Microsoft's done an amazing job at I think they had Super Bowl commercials. Focusing on actually a little side point, the AI craze. I mean, we'll hit some metrics with this, but a lot of people want to adopt AI.
Yeah.
But a lot of their infrastructure needs to be in position to do that correctly. And if you look at the big players in the space, like OpenAI as an example, Microsoft Copilot, all this stuff, it is much easier to do this when you're in Azure because you're sitting next to the resources you want to be leveraging. So even if you're trying to get your organization ready for this kind of stuff, maybe you're not even having investigations into Azure, but you keep looking down the AI rabbit hole. Well, take off the curtain, it's Azure behind it.
Right.
So, if you're looking for more information, as they reach out to your trusted partners, take a look at what Microsoft's kind of putting out there. They always have a lot of information. They're doing webinars, constant ads, and just really ask around in the community, right? If you're part of any, Chamber of Commerce, things like that, talk to other businesses, ask what they're doing. We're seeing very much a huge market shift into virtual desktoping in Azure. I've seen it huge in accounting firms, like law, as we mentioned earlier. Manufacturing starting to make a move as well. There's more hybridization occurring in those. So, talk to people in your actual industry, and there's a very good chance someone will say they're in Azure, and it's really changed the way they're doing things.
That's awesome. I really appreciate it, Matt. And I hate to do this to you, but with the last point, it brought back one more thing I want to ask you about.
Yeah,
And I'd love for you to explain to me what Azure Local is. So maybe I know I've heard about Azure and I've kind of done some research and I've gone online and I see this like, hold on, Azure on my site. Like what is that whole thing all about?
Yeah. So it's funny how we talked about getting the physical hardware out of your environment, but Azure Local is like the reversing of that role. It is a node or a point that gets installed in your local network that allows you to bring Azure resources home. Now, the general reasoning for this would be, we talked about some of the internet requirements above. There occasionally could be very highly sensitive workloads that perhaps need to remain on premise, but you want to leverage certain resources to deliver that, like virtual desktoping. So it allows you to kind of build this hybridization mode where perhaps your main infrastructure and your main organization all lives up in Azure, but you have these fringe sites that are very hard to get to, maybe have very poor internet connectivity and need access to a lot of the same information. You can put an Azure local node, and then it'll stream and communicate back to Azure. But the heavy lifting of like the desktoping, as an example, will live in-house. So you can essentially take that and provide, very uniform experience across the organizations, regardless of the connectivity. Now, SMBs probably not going to use that, right? This is really going to be for, mid-market kind of levels and deployments. And there's very big use cases for that, for edge computing is what they would really call it. So that's really where you'd position these Azure locals.
So just as a follow-up question, let's say we're dealing with a large construction company or building roads, those kinds of things, with site trailers kind of all over the place and using Starlink. Is this kind of a situation where you might put an Azure node in a trailer communicating and leave the organization in Azure?
That is a use case. I suppose the risk or the issue would be moving a large piece of hardware around in a trailer, right? So it depends on what's being done. Starlink is a good intermediary to provide access to virtual desktoping. Again, it needs to be assessed. Where I would see it is if they're doing a lot of computational modeling on premise. Maybe the engineers are in that booth and it's like, look, I need to move like large amount of files and work on them really fast. That's a good use for Azure Local, because they can reference the data and the models up front, but then do all the computational workload on premise.
Local. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, listen, I really appreciate it. I've taken a little more time than I'd hoped to steal from you.
No problem.
So I really appreciate it. Hopefully we can do this again next time. Maybe we can talk a little bit about AI, because I'd love to go down that rabbit hole. All right, man. Appreciate it. Thanks so much, Matt.
Always a pleasure. Take care.
Cheers.